The first dilemma is from Lalo. Hey Jordan, I have a serious question about fapping and might be a stupid one in my opinion. Does fapping still count by touching yourself getting hard without finishing? Does that still count or is it cheating? Side note, I've been in the NoFap zone for 8 months. Alright Lalo, so this is probably my biggest issue with NoFap, is that a lot of times more emphasis and attention is placed on NoFap as opposed to whatever you're replacing that habit with. Right now, in the past, I've kind of wavered back and forth on if NoFap is not only sustainable, but if it's even impactful in your life over the long term. And I've come to the realization in these past few weeks, as I've accidentally re-implemented NoFap into my life, that it actually does make an impact and that I was more or less wrong about NoFap. That's not to say that everything that I said was wrong, but here's the thing with NoFap. Okay, NoFap can be very, very toxic if you have the sort of mentality that focuses more on the negative aspect as opposed to the positive aspect. And what I mean by that is, if you're placing your attention on NoFap, then you're only drawing more of that energy to you and eventually you're going to relapse. And when you relapse, it'll be much more mentally and emotionally debilitating for you, and via the placebo effect, even physically debilitating for you, because you've placed all of your energy and attention into not doing something. Whereas if you placed your energy on the positive aspect, i.e. utilizing the law of substitution to replace that activity with something else, also known as sexual transmutation, you're taking that energy and simply placing it elsewhere. For some people it might be school, for some people it might be the gym, for some people it might be starting that YouTube channel or that business that you've been wanting to start. But the point is that if you don't focus on what you are doing as opposed to what you're not doing, eventually you're going to end up relapsing. And you'll go a year or 2 years or even 5 years, but that one relapse will make you feel like you've reset all of your progress, when in reality, you've actually generated 5 years, or however long you've gone, worth of momentum in building up your discipline. Right? Don't focus so much on how to not relapse or how to keep the streak going. Focus more on living your life. This is what NoFap is actually all about. And this is why I don't even think it should be called NoFap. I think it should be called pro-living life. Okay, I understand that's not as catchy, but you have to understand that if you're focusing on not doing something, the likelihood of you doing that thing becomes much, much higher. For example, if I made it my mission to not get a ticket when I drive my car, the likelihood of me getting a ticket becomes much higher. Whereas if I focus on simply driving in a safe and careful manner and having regard and respect for the people around me as well as myself when I'm on the road, then the chances of me getting a ticket or any sort of traffic violation becomes much, much lower, because I'm focused on the positive aspect. This is the way that our minds work. When you focus on the negative aspect, all you're doing is focusing on that thing, and your mind doesn't make the distinction between doing it and not doing it. All it knows is that that's your predominant thought pattern. And based on the question that you asked me, I can tell that this is your predominant thought pattern. Relapsing is your predominant thought pattern. And if you continue to entertain that mindset, at some point or another, you're going to relapse. And it's going to affect you much more than it should. Now, with that being said, the next dilemma is from Tejas. How often should you fap without porn? So, again, I'm sure that you're referencing my last NoFap video where I said that I'm quitting NoFap. And a lot of what I said in that video, I do still agree with. I do believe that pornography is, more often than not, the most detrimental part of the PMO cycle, because ultimately, when you do the other part, okay, when you relapse without the content, your body simply regenerates whatever you've lost. So nothing is lost, especially if you're a young man. You're, 19 years old? The previous question, Lalo, was 18 years old. You're young men. Most of you watching this are young men. And you shouldn't have to worry about if your body is going to replenish it. Now, as far as the psychological effects of it, the psychological implications of relapsing with or without the content, you're always going to get more, in my opinion, out of life if you focus on other things as opposed to just the instant gratification that comes from relapsing. And this also includes sex. Sex with a woman or a man, whatever you're into. I don't know what you're into, but sex as well can be a distraction and a hindrance. These things should be done in moderation at most. But if you're doing NoFap, I'm going to assume, and this was my mistake in the past, was assuming that you didn't have an addiction. If you're doing NoFap, the chances are that you already have an addiction, and moderation is simply not an option for you at this point. And that's something that I need to take into account moving forward, is that if I make a NoFap video, or if I say that I'm quitting NoFap, I might be enabling people who actually have an addiction. And even though I wouldn't say that I had a long-term addiction like some of you have, I do understand that it's a very slippery slope. It is a very slippery slope because this sort of addiction is easily accessible. It is very easily accessible, and also your body is always going to crave it because it's natural. It's not like alcohol or drugs where a lot of these things are either man-made or just in some way, shape, form, or fashion manipulated by corporations to essentially keep you in these cycles. Okay, they put certain things into these substances that hook you in. Sex is something that we don't need to have that external stimulation in order to desire. We naturally crave it. So in that way, we kind of have to learn how to moderate, and for some people, moderation begins with elimination, right? And I'm saying all of this to say that if you're asking that question, you probably shouldn't be doing it. If you don't know how often is too much for you, you probably should not be doing it at all. Now, eventually, you might reach a point where you can do it in moderation, and again, when you reach that point where you're no longer addicted, you won't have to ask the question of what moderation actually is, because that's subjective. We all have different sex drives. But understand that there's no magic number of, oh, I should do it once a week or 3 times a week, 5 times a week. Everybody's body works different. Some people can do it 10 times in one day. Some people can do it 1 time in 10 days. Everybody's body is different, and that's why nobody on this platform who is honest can give you a true answer to that, because they don't know your body as well as you do. Now, understand this. Okay, let me go ahead and make this distinction right now before you guys click off this video and get on these websites. I believe that pornography should be completely eliminated from your life forever. I don't think that that's something that you should implement even with moderation, because it's just like drugs. Pornography is really a drug. It's like cigarettes, alcohol, any of these other addictive substances that are specifically curated to keep you hooked on them. Okay, these are things that are not natural. Pornography is not natural. Sex is natural, but you guys know as well as I do that more often than not, when you start watching pornography, you're not watching the type of sex that you're going to have with a woman. Okay, you're just not. And especially if you've been consuming pornography for a long period of time, you're not going to be sitting there watching regular people having regular sex. That's not what you're watching. You're watching people who are trained professionals have sex in ways that you can never really dream of. And I'm not here to crush your dreams or anything, but I'm saying this to say that pornography can give you a very unrealistic and unhealthy perception of sex, which should be an act of not just physical intimacy, but emotional intimacy. I feel like because of pornography and sexualization of people in general on social media, because again, these corporations, they understand that sex is an innate desire that we all have, and if they feed into that, they will always have us hooked. Okay, you gotta be aware of these things. But when you consume this sort of content, what ends up happening is you become so desensitized to it that regular sex is no longer appealing to you. And I'm speaking from not just one experience, but multiple experiences where I myself have had trouble with regular sex because my mind had become so desensitized to it. And I started watching this content at a much later age than most people. So if you started watching it at 11 years old and you were addicted from there on forth, then understand that you have some work to do. And that work begins today. You have to start off by taking charge of your life and eliminating that content altogether. Now, for some of you, you might have to take this in steps, meaning that you might have to compromise with yourself and say, okay, I'm going to do the physical action without the content. And that will be my transition program. I'll wean myself off of that. For some of you, you might have to go cold turkey. I've taken both approaches personally, and I found that going cold turkey works best for me. But it won't work best for all of you. You might just have to experiment with these things. Nevertheless, The content is going to be 95% of the problem. Again, as far as physically releasing, it doesn't matter whether you do it with a woman or in your bed at home in the middle of the night. Your body is going to react in more or less the same exact way. You have similar thought patterns, you have mental clarity. These are things that are consistent. And also your body will regenerate. It will regenerate whatever has been lost in this scenario. But the psychological effects of pornography are much more difficult for your body to quantify, and because of this can be very, very difficult for you to recover from, especially once it begins to seep into your subconscious mind and thus affect the way that you perceive sex, which can in turn affect your performance in bed. Right? And like I said, I'm speaking from experience with this. This is not something that you want to go through. It's not fun to go through this. It is not enjoyable at all, especially if you're with a woman that you actually love. So be aware of this and understand that, again, it's not so much about anti-porn, it's more about focusing on what you actually want out of life. The chances are, okay, we all want sex, we all know that, but the chances are that not only do you want sex, but you actually want emotional intimacy at some level as well. We all want to feel accepted. It's on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We all want to feel accepted. And you have to keep that in mind. You have to prioritize that desire to have emotional intimacy, to be understood and accepted for who you are, as opposed to the physical and psychological instant gratification that comes from the PMO cycle. It's all about focusing on the positive aspect. What are you replacing PMO with? For me, it's been YouTube, as well as this skill that I've been learning in my off time and learning Dutch and just generally working on myself, right? Getting my life together. I have certain situations that I'm currently trying to climb out of, and that preoccupies a good portion of my perception on a day-to-day basis, to where I don't even have leftover energy to be doing PMO. But for some of you, you might not be in a situation that's as dire as mine, and so your level of concentration and focus may not be where mine is. You have to find something that is that important to you. You have to find something that is more important to you than PMO. And it may not happen overnight, but in the meantime, what you can do is, like I said, ask yourself what will really work for you. Going cold turkey or weaning yourself off of it. And if you're weaning yourself off of it, again, there's no magic number of moderation for everybody, but start off by just cutting out the content and then listening to your body. And then from there, you can slowly but surely lessen it until you reach a point that you believe is reasonable. A point where you feel like you're healthy and you're not drained all the time, and the psychological damage, more importantly, is no longer present in your day-to-day life to distort your reality and your perception of women and intimacy.